He called me overhead in front of 41 people, and he did it smiling, not shouting, not even unkind if you didn't know him, just that easy, sunburned golf course voice, like he was reading a weather report. Look, I love Renata. Everyone loves Renata. But if we're being honest about lean operating models, some of this org chart is just legacy overhead, cost centers wearing tenure like a shield. Nobody laughed. Nobody breathed either. 41 people in a Tuesday morning ops review, and the only sound was the projector fan and the faint tick of the wall clock, and Trent Ashcombe standing at the front of the room in a quarter zip that cost more than my first car, sipping an oat milk cortado like he hadn't just detonated something. I was 46 years old. I had been vice president of global manufacturing and supply at Ashcombe and Vale Home Goods for 14 years. I had built the sourcing network that put a sofa in 1 out of every 11 American living rooms with a big box delivery sticker still on the cushion. I had personally flown to 3 countries during a pandemic to keep container ships from stranding $40 million of inventory in the Pacific, while my husband held vigil beside a hospital bed I couldn't leave a continent to reach. I had trained half the buyers in that room. I had negotiated the contract that saved this company's Q3 numbers in a year everyone else had already written off as a loss. Trent Ashcombe had been at the company for 11 months. His actual title was Chief Transformation Officer, which is corporate for the chairman's son, but legal won't let us just say CEO in waiting on the org chart yet. He had a jaw like it had been drawn with a ruler, and a resume that, according to 2 separate people in HR who probably shouldn't have told me, had been quietly padded by his father's assistant before anyone at the company ever laid eyes on it. His last job, at a DTC mattress startup that flamed out spectacularly, had ended in what people call a mutual parting, and what people who'd actually worked there called getting walked out by security after the board found out he'd greenlit a marketing campaign built on a plagiarized ad script. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was Walter Ashcombe's only son, and Walter Ashcombe owned 61% of the company whose supply chain I had spent a third of my adult life building brick by brick, container by container, factory relationship by factory relationship, until it worked so quietly and so well that almost nobody in that boardroom understood what it would take to break it. Almost nobody. I didn't say a word. I clicked to the next slide out of pure muscle memory, some autopilot professionalism that I will never fully understand. Finished the sourcing update as if my ears weren't ringing, thanked the room, and closed my laptop with hands that were, miraculously, not shaking. Not yet. In the women's restroom on the 4th floor, I locked the handicap stall, the only one with a door that reached the floor, and sat down on the closed lid in my cream silk blouse like a woman attending her own funeral. And I stared at the grout between the black subway tiles until my pulse stopped hammering in my molars. 14 cracks in the grout. 14 years. I counted them twice to make sure, because counting things was the only thing keeping me from putting my fist through the paper towel dispenser. I had survived layoffs before. I had sat in rooms where we cut entire departments the way you trim fat off a steak. Clinical, cold, necessary. And I had hated every second of it, and done it anyway, because that was the job. But this was different. This wasn't a cost center getting cut. This was a message, delivered in front of an audience, on purpose, with a smile, by a boy who didn't know my name 3 weeks before I trained his father's board on inventory forecasting. This wasn't a layoff. This was a public execution with a save the date. And here's the part that scared me more than the humiliation itself. the way he'd said it. Not angry, not even really contemptuous. Comfortable. Like a man reading from a script he already knew the ending of. Like he wasn't threatening me, he was just informing me of a decision that had already been made somewhere I wasn't in the room for. He had a plan. That thought sat in my chest like a swallowed stone the rest of the walk back to my desk, where a yellow Post-it note was already waiting on my monitor in HR's aggressively cheerful cursive. Trent would like to see you at 3:30, conference room B. I texted my husband Daniel from under my desk like a teenager passing notes in class. Looks like today's the day. He wrote back in 11 seconds. Want me to bring the good bourbon or the shotgun? I laughed out loud at my desk, alone, and two analysts, 2 cubicles over, looked up like I'd finally cracked. Maybe I had. It just didn't feel like the kind of cracking anyone expected. At 3:30 sharp, I walked into conference room B, and Trent was already seated at the head of the table like he'd been born there, flanked by 2 HR representatives wearing the specific, practiced softness of people who are paid to watch you lose your job without flinching. Renata. Trent said my name like we'd gone to summer camp together. First, thank you, genuinely. You've been an incredible asset to this company. A real institution. An institution? Like a courthouse. Like something load-bearing you tear down anyway because the land underneath is worth more than the building. There was a folder on the table between us, glossy, corporate, and far too thick to be a routine memo. I already knew what it was before anyone opened it. You learn to recognize an exit packet the way you learn to recognize a storm front. The air changes first. We're restructuring the transformation office, Trent went on, and I noticed he used the word transformation 4 times in 90 seconds, like a man who'd been coached to say it until it stopped sounding like a threat. Leaner, more agile, and honestly, I think this could be an incredible opportunity for you, a chance to land somewhere that really sees your value. I opened the folder myself, because I refused to let him hand it to me like a communion wafer. The severance was generous. Absurdly generous. 9 months of base salary, full bonus payout, every unvested option accelerated and cashed at the current share price. A non-disparagement clause that ran both directions, which told me everything. Companies don't buy silence that expensively unless silence is worth more than the money. I looked up. You want me gone, and you want me happy about it. Trent smiled the smile of a man who genuinely believed he had just invented diplomacy. I want you to land on your feet. There doesn't need to be any bad blood here. That single sentence told me the whole truth of the room. This wasn't generosity. This was insurance. Somebody, and it wasn't Trent didn't have the imagination for insurance, had decided that whatever was coming next was worth paying handsomely to keep me quiet, cooperative, and far, far away from a courtroom. I signed it anyway, calmly, with a pen that didn't shake and a throat that felt like I'd swallowed a lit match. I shook Trent's hand. I even smiled. A real smile, which unsettled him more than tears would have, I could tell by the way his eyes flickered. I walked out of that building like I had a lunch reservation, not a career funeral, because I had spent 14 years learning that the worst thing you can ever hand an enemy is your visible pain. I did not go home and cry into a glass of wine, although I want to tell you I did, because it would make a tidier story. I went home, and I opened the safe in the back of my closet, the one Daniel jokes is for either jewelry or a body, and I took out a manila folder I had kept hidden there for 6 months, long before Trent Ashcombe had learned where the executive bathroom was. stamped across the top in my own handwriting, because I have always been the kind of person who does not trust her secrets to a laptop. Del Rio, Confidential. Trent didn't know the real game had started long before he'd ever had his name engraved on an office door. He didn't know that for 6 months I had been in quiet, careful, deniable talks with Mateo Del Rio, founder and majority owner of Del Rio Casework Group, the manufacturing partner in Guadalajara that built, cut, finished, and shipped 72% of every piece of furniture Ashcombe and Vail sold in North America. He didn't know Mateo was in the middle of a brutal, headline-adjacent divorce that had left him desperate to sell before his soon-to-be ex-wife's lawyers could get their hands on valuation numbers. He didn't know that I had flown to Guadalajara myself, alone, on a Saturday, in a gray blazer, and come home with a handshake, a term sheet scribbled on a hotel notepad, and a signed NDA so airtight it would take a forensic accountant a year to find the seam. He didn't know any of that. He would. Monday morning arrived like a held breath finally let out. I hadn't slept, not from grief, from arithmetic. I lay awake running margins, lead times, freight contracts, projected client churn, over and over, until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being a weapon. The severance Trent thought would buy my silence had just become the down payment on my leverage. It's a strange, almost funny thing, handing your firing squad the gun and only later realizing you were the one who'd loaded it. At 7:50 that morning, I drove 2 hours south to a nondescript industrial park that housed Del Rio Casework Group's North American holding office. No signage, no logo, just a keypad door and a hallway light that buzzed like it was in physical pain. Mateo Del Rio met me in the break room, if you could call a room with a dying coffee maker and a vending machine that leaned 3 degrees to the left a break room. He looked like a man who'd spent 30 years standing next to table saws, sun-creased, thick forearmed, wearing a flannel that had seen better decades. "You sure you want this headache?" he asked, pouring coffee that smelled faintly of scorched rubber into 2 paper cups. "The minute you sign, you inherit every ghost this place has collected since 1994. Union disputes, a warehouse fire we still haven't fully explained to the insurance company. My brother-in-law, who still thinks he's owed a job." "I run global manufacturing for a furniture company," I said. "I've already danced with the devil. This is just his cousin." He laughed, a real one, from the gut, and slid a folder across the table. 51%, controlling interest, pending wire confirmation. I funded it from 3 places because no single account I owned could cover it alone. And I have never in my life trusted a plan that depended on only one door staying open. My severance, obviously, the whole 9 months of it, wired the same afternoon it cleared. A quiet liquidation of a small tech investment Daniel and I had made a decade earlier, back when it was still the kind of thing you explained apologetically at dinner parties. And the third source, the one that cost me something no wire transfer ever could. A loan against my late sister Colette's trust. Money I had sworn on her memory I would never touch unless it was to save something worth saving. It was. And it tasted, if I'm honest, exactly like the oat milk cortado Trent had been sipping when he called me overhead. By 11:40 that morning, I held controlling interest in Del Rio Casework Group. By 1:15, I was registered in their internal systems as interim board chair. By 2 o'clock, I was drafting a freight and fulfillment restructuring letter that would land on Ashcombe and Vail's desk like a wrecking ball wrapped in velvet. No lawsuits, no fireworks, no public drama. Just a quiet, contractually permissible 11% price adjustment, and an equally quiet, equally permissible pause on preferred production scheduling, pending what I called, with a straight face, capacity realignment. Trent wouldn't see it coming. He probably didn't even know Del Rio's name. Procurement handled vendor relationships 2 layers below his pay grade, which meant the fallout would hit him weeks before he ever identified where the storm was actually coming from. I was still savoring that thought, coffee cold in my hand, sun coming in sideways through the blinds of my home office, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Houston area code, which made no sense. Nothing in this deal touched Houston. I let it ring out. It buzzed again 10 seconds later. A text this time. We should talk. Your move didn't go unnoticed. V. I stared at that single letter until the room felt 10 degrees colder. V. There was exactly one person in my professional life who had ever signed her messages that way, in the years before she vanished from the company entirely. Vivian Ashcombe, Trent's mother, Walter Ashcombe's ex-wife, and, before the divorce quietly erased her name from every masthead and press release, the woman who had built half the brand herself. I hadn't spoken to her in 7 years, not since the buyout that pushed her out of her 12% ownership stake and out of the building entirely, dressed up in a press release about pursuing new creative ventures. The fact that she was texting me now, the same week, the same hours, before I had even filed a single public document, meant one of two things. Either I had made a catastrophic operational error somewhere in a deal I thought was airtight, or somebody else had been planning a war a long time before I ever picked up my sword. And I had just walked, eyes wide open, directly onto her battlefield. I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I went for a walk. Not the calming kind. The kind where your legs move because your body needs somewhere to put the adrenaline your mind refuses to burn off. Every step asked a question I didn't want answered. Why now? Why her? How did she know? There were exactly 5 people on Earth who knew I was Del Rio's new majority owner, and none of them had any reason or any relationship to Vivian Ashcombe that would explain a leak. I hadn't even filed the public ownership disclosures yet, which meant either Vivian had someone inside my deal, or Vivian was the deal, and I just hadn't seen the wiring yet. In her years at the company, Vivian Ashcombe had been more feared than her husband and twice as respected. She'd built the brand from a regional catalog outfit into a household name. She ran marketing the way some people run intelligence agencies. Quietly, precisely, and with a memory like a filing cabinet that never forgot a slight. Employees used to call her the Iron Hand in Kashmir, because if she decided you were finished, you wouldn't even feel the blade until your badge stopped working. And then, 7 years ago, she simply disappeared. No public statement beyond a single line in a quarterly filing. No LinkedIn activity, no interviews, no trace. Just whispered rumors about a settlement so thorough it had apparently purchased not just her silence, but her total erasure from the company's story. Until, apparently, now. At 5 that evening, I finally cracked and texted back. What do you want? The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, like she was drafting and redrafting, even though she'd clearly known exactly what she wanted to say for years. Dinner. Just us. Some long overdue honesty. Solène's, tomorrow, 7 sharp. You'll want to hear this. Solène's wasn't a restaurant so much as an institution. The place where the city's actual power ate quietly in the back corners while everyone at the bar pretended not to notice. She'd booked it on a Wednesday, which is not a coincidence, not from a woman like her. A Wednesday dinner is a business meeting wearing a napkin. At 7:04 the next evening, Vivian was already seated, turning a glass of Barolo the size of a christening font slowly in her hand. She looked untouched by the 7 years, Like she'd made a deal with time itself and then negotiated its severance package too. She didn't say hello. She slid a slim envelope across the table without a word. Inside were 3 photographs and a printed page. The first, Trent, shaking hands with Mateo Del Rio in what was unmistakably a hotel lobby, dated 4 months ago, long before I'd ever made my own approach. The second, a scanned stock transfer term sheet, also dated before my buyout, structured to acquire a minority stake in Del Rio through an offshore holding entity. The third, an email chain between Trent and someone named Preston Cole, Del Rio's outside financial advisor, it turned out, not mine, discussing a vertical integration opportunity that would let Ashcombe and Vail absorb its own supplier and control the entire cost structure top to bottom. My mouth went dry. He was trying to beat me to it. He was, Vivian said, voice like ash dusted over silk. But he's too arrogant to check who actually held the swing shares before he moved. That's why your timing mattered more than you understood. You didn't just buy 51% of a furniture factory, Renata. You blocked my son's entire consolidation play. He wanted to buy his own supplier. He wanted control of the one part of this business he doesn't understand well enough to run, so he could gut it, inflate the valuation on paper, and exit in 2 years with a golden parachute stitched by his father's lawyers. She let that sit. You ruined it. Beautifully. Accidentally. I sat back. So what is this? A victory lap? This is an offer. She didn't blink. Keep your controlling stake. I want in for 5%. Silent. I feed you intelligence, you make the moves, and within 6 months my son will be dangling from strings he genuinely believes he tied himself. I laughed, and it came out sharper than I meant it to. Why would I trust you with anything? Something in her eyes went hard and old, the way granite looks after a very long winter. Because I hate my son's father more than you will ever hate my son. And because you and I are the only 2 women who ever built anything real inside that building. And both of us got erased for it. For a long moment, the table between us felt like disputed territory. 2 women who had each bled, in very different decades, for the exact same throne. And then, slowly, I reached for the wine list. If we were going to burn a dynasty down together, I decided, we were at least going to do it with something decent to toast. The first strike didn't come from Trent. It came from accounting 3 days later, precise as a sniper round. An internal audit request landed in Del Rio's inbox titled, in the flattest language imaginable, Clarification of Vendor Ownership Relationships. Neutral wording. Neon subtext. Trent knew, or at least suspected. Someone had tipped him off. Probably Preston Cole, his CFO adjacent advisor, a man with all the spine of a beige curtain and none of the discretion required to actually keep a secret. That's when the phone calls started. Procurement leads I'd trained, warehouse supervisors who'd worked under me for a decade. Even a junior analyst I'd mentored 3 years earlier sent me a panicked text. Renata, is it true you bought Del Rio? Devin in Ops says we're about to lose our whole scheduling priority. Please tell me you're not about to tank the department. And that was the moment I understood, with total clarity, that the most dangerous weapon Trent Ashcombe had was never going to be money, or title, or even his father's signature. It was fear. Fear moving quietly through the ranks. Fear that picking the wrong side of a succession war would get you purged by whichever Ashcombe came out standing. That night, Vivian called. I told you he'd sniff it out eventually, she said, flat as a countertop. He's not smart, but he's paranoid. And paranoid people move fast and sloppy. I was pacing barefoot across my kitchen, wine untouched, storm rolling in against the windows. So what's next? He'll play the victim. Wounded founder's son narrative. He'll say you're an unstable former employee lashing out, emotionally compromised, vindictive, unable to let go of a job that outgrew you. That'll land beautifully right after I just cut Del Rio's freight losses by 9% and signed 3 new client contracts, I said dryly. Her voice dropped, almost gentle, almost. And I want to be honest that at the time I found this touching rather than alarming, which tells you everything about how good she was. Renata, you need to hit him somewhere personal. Professional threats he can navigate. His father's lawyers eat those for breakfast. But humiliate him in front of the board, publicly, in a way he can't spin? That he can't survive. I didn't answer her that night, but the next morning, I made a call to Douglas Kane. Douglas owned Kane Retail Group, one of Ashcombe & Vale's largest wholesale clients, and, more usefully, he despised Trent Ashcombe with the specific, personal loathing of a man who'd once been publicly mocked by him. 18 months earlier, at a trade show in Atlanta, Trent had gotten 2 drinks past his limit and loudly compared Douglas's new wife to a Costco version of a runway model, in front of 6 other retail buyers, 3 of whom had phones out and recording before he'd even finished the sentence. The clip never went viral. Ashcombe's PR team was fast, but Douglas never forgot it. He'd simply been waiting, out of professional inertia and lack of a better supplier, for a reason to act. I gave him one. When we met for coffee, I didn't pitch anything. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Del Rio's new exclusive distribution terms, 9% below anything Ashcombe & Vale could match, with guaranteed lead times and freight cost stability locked for 18 months. Douglas read it twice, looked up. He finally stepped on the wrong throat, huh? I'm just offering you the door, I said, sipping my coffee. You're the one who gets to decide whether to walk through it or slam it on the way out. He signed that afternoon. By Friday, Ashcombe & Vale's fulfillment team was in visible chaos. An email leaked internally, God bless whichever intern forwarded it externally by accident, subject line, urgent, Kane accounts on hold, who approved this? Trent hadn't been seen at headquarters in 2 days. The official story was that he was working remote. The unofficial story, whispered through 3 group chats I still had access to because nobody had thought to remove me, was that he was locked in his loft, sweating through a crisis with no idea whose fault to assign it to yet. That weekend, a courier envelope arrived at my house. No return address, just my name, block letters on the front. Inside was a single printed photograph. Trent, shirtless, tumbler of whiskey in one hand, his other arm slung around Preston Cole in a way that read a great deal more intimate than a professional working relationship generally requires. Timestamp in the corner, Thursday, 3:41 a.m. On the back, in looping cursive I now recognized instantly, everyone has leverage. You just have to decide where to press. V. It hit me then, standing in my kitchen with that photo in my hand, that Vivian Ashcombe wasn't feeding me intelligence one piece at a time. She was conducting an entire symphony of destruction. And I had just realized, with a small cold drop in my stomach, that I was the loudest instrument in her orchestra, not the composer. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the photograph, exactly. The image of Trent half drunk and draped over his own advisor at 4 a.m. was more strange than shocking. It was what the photograph represented. It wasn't blackmail material. It was a message. Vivian was telling me, without saying it outright, that she had surveillance, that she'd been watching every move in that building for longer than I wanted to consider, that she had plans layered on plans, and I had only ever been shown the one closest to the surface. Here's the problem with brilliant conspirators, though. They tend to forget that not everyone enjoys discovering they're a pawn, even when the game happens to be tilted in their favor. Sunday afternoon, I called her. No greeting. "I want the truth. How long have you been planning this?" She didn't even pause. "Since the day your father-in-law, Walter, called me a brand liability in front of outside counsel and offered me a settlement to disappear quietly. That was 7 years ago. I waited for the right kind of storm," she said, cool as marble. "And then you walked in like lightning looking for somewhere to land." I laughed once, short and humorless. "And what happens after we burn it all down? Because this isn't strategy anymore, Vivian. This is revenge, and you're not even bothering to hide it." Her pause was brief, but I felt its weight travel down the phone line. "I want my company back. Not the name on the building, I never needed that. I want what's true underneath it, and I don't particularly care who has to fall to get me there." That was the first moment I felt real hesitation, because of how she said fall. It wasn't metaphorical in her mouth. It was a logistics term. Vivian Ashcombe was not playing for satisfaction. She was playing for keeps. And if I wasn't careful, I was going to end up as collateral damage, wearing a crown I never asked for and hadn't earned. I didn't back out. Not yet. Because just as she had maneuvered me into pushing the first domino, Trent had already started pushing back on his own. Monday morning brought the email, subject line, "Urgent, Del Rio vendor suspension." Trent had frozen all Ashcombe and Vale purchase orders with Del Rio, citing quality assurance discrepancies and referencing an audit report that, as far as I could determine after 3 hours of digging, did not actually exist. Effective immediately, Del Rio was under performance review. Orders halted, payments paused, all communication rerouted through outside counsel. It was a corporate siege, plain and simple, and I grinned reading it, because Trent had no idea I had already rerouted nearly half of the affected shipments through 2 smaller distribution entities I had quietly set up under a holding company weeks earlier. Same product, same trucks, different paperwork. His suspension was a door slammed on an empty room. The furniture was already moving out the back. But optics were a different battlefield entirely, and I needed to answer publicly. So I did. I drafted a short, elegant, faintly lethal open letter and posted it under Del Rio's corporate account. At Del Rio Casework Group, we stand fully behind the quality and reliability of our manufacturing. Any delays experienced by client organizations reflect internal policy shifts on their end, not any change in our operations or standards. We remain ready, willing, and fully capable of serving every contract currently in force. What we will not do is compromise on transparency. I hit publish at 2:13 in the afternoon. By 2:30, a trade publication had picked it up. By 3, 2 more Ashcombe and Vale wholesale clients had reached out to Del Rio directly, quietly asking whether they could source around their existing supplier entirely. At 4:07, Vivian texted, "Well played." He's pacing his father's office, calling it sabotage. Daddy's already sided with the board on an internal review. A second message followed a minute later. Also, he just had a visitor. Attached was a grainy still, clearly pulled from a building's own security footage, of Trent standing across from a man in an expensive slate gray suit, the specific, unmistakable species of suit that arrives bundled with a retainer and an exit clause. He was lawyering up. I stared at that image the way you stare at an oncoming train, too fascinated by the inevitability of it to look away. The idiot thought he could sue me. Part of me, the part that still remembered being called overhead in front of 41 silent colleagues, genuinely wanted to let him try. The lawsuit hit my inbox at 8:01 the following morning, sharp as if it had been scheduled by a vengeance-obsessed intern with a countdown clock. Subject line: Ashcombe and Vale Home Goods versus Renata Callaway and Del Rio Casework Group. Notice of preliminary injunction motion. It read like a soap opera scripted by an aggrieved trust fund. Tortious interference, breach of a non-disparagement clause I had, in fact, never violated. Corporate espionage, my personal favorite, since it implied I owned a single piece of surveillance equipment more sophisticated than my kitchen thermostat. And, buried in paragraph 14 like they were embarrassed to lead with it, emotional instability resulting in retaliatory acquisition of a former business partner. I half expected the next line to accuse me of hexing the warehouse. I read it 3 times, slower each pass, and by the third read I understood what it actually was. It wasn't built to win. It was built to stall. If the court granted even a temporary injunction, it could freeze Del Rio's ability to sign new contracts for weeks. And Trent knew exactly which 3 partnerships I was in the final stages of closing. He didn't need to beat me in court. He just needed to jam the gears long enough to flood his father's board with chaos, install himself as the wounded party, and get my name attached to a press release like a cautionary tale about scorned former employees. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just the defendant in this story. I had receipts. And so, as it turned out, did someone with a far longer memory than mine. At noon, my attorney, Naomi Reyes, a woman whose entire professional reputation could be summarized in 3 words: unflinching, unbothered, undefeated. And I walked into Ashcombe Tower like we were hunting something with fangs. The board had been summoned for an emergency session. Trent believed he was walking into an ambush of me in front of an audience on his home turf. Instead, Naomi distributed slim black folders around the table like party favors nobody had asked for. Inside each one, a detailed, dated, sourced timeline of Trent's unauthorized communications with Del Rio's financial advisor, his attempts to inflate shipping and quality control costs to depress the company's valuation before his own quiet acquisition attempt, and a full ownership trace of the offshore holding entity he'd used to structure that attempted buyout. 2 layers deep, then deeper, at the very bottom, a shell company, and at the bottom of that shell company, Trent Ashcombe's own name, misspelled but fully notarized. He hadn't just tried to acquire Del Rio. He had tried to buy his own family's most critical supplier out from under his own father, using investor money the board had never approved, structured specifically to hide his fingerprints. When those documents hit the table, the room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. You could have heard a hairpin reconsider its entire existence. Trent stammered. This is completely taken out of context. You were defrauding your own company, Naomi said, voice as clean as a scalpel. And the woman you tried to humiliate out of a job beat you to the grave, and then started renting out the plot. His face went a deep, mottled red, throat working like a fish that had just discovered air was not, in fact, an improvement. She orchestrated this whole thing. She bought Del Rio specifically to sabotage us. I stepped forward before anyone else could speak for me. Correction. I bought Del Rio to survive. You turned it into sabotage the moment you tried to gut my career and sell the pieces for parts in a boardroom you thought I'd never see the inside of again. You started this war assuming I'd disappear quietly. Here we are instead." Nobody at that table said a word. Their faces said everything. And then came the moment I understood, with absolute certainty, that I had won the room. Walter Ashcombe, Trent's father, the company's chairman, a man I had worked alongside for 14 years and who had never once, in all that time, used my first name in front of clients, finally leaned forward, took off his glasses, and said quietly, "Trent, step outside." "Dad, you can't be—" "Now." Trent shot me a look on his way out that I imagine he intended to be threatening. It landed instead as something closer to a small, spoiled child discovering for the very first time that the world does not actually revolve around him. The mask had fully come off. Then Walter turned to me. "Did you plan all of this?" "No," I said evenly. "He did. I just had better aim." A long silence stretched between us, thick enough to lean on. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for since I walked in the door. "What would it take to make this go away?" And that's when I saw it in his eyes. Not regret, not even embarrassment. Fear. He understood, finally, what this actually was. Shareholder exposure, regulatory scrutiny, a paper trail that could burn far hotter than a bad press cycle if I decided I wanted it to. I leaned in. "I don't want a settlement. I don't want hush money. I want a clean separation. Ashcombe and Vale's ownership ties to Del Rio dissolved publicly and in full. And I want Trent's resignation, in writing, effective immediately." His jaw tightened. "You're not leaving me much room." "No," I agreed, "but I am leaving you a company." He nodded once and handed my attorney a pen. The official statement hit the wires 36 hours later, effective immediately. Trent Ashcombe has stepped down from his role at Ashcombe and Vale Home Goods to pursue new opportunities. The board thanks him for his contributions during a period of organizational transition. Classic corporate embalming fluid. No mention of the lawsuit, no mention of Del Rio. Absolutely no mention of the fact that, according to two separate people who witnessed it and immediately texted me, Trent had left the building escorted by security while shouting into a Bluetooth earpiece like a reality show contestant 3 seconds from a full breakdown on camera. The board swallowed its medicine. In exchange, I signed the release that killed the lawsuit, sealed, mutual, sanitized down to nothing. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like the ending of one of those satisfying videos where the villain gets exactly what's coming to him, and the credits roll over a triumphant swell of music. Instead, I sat in my car outside the courthouse for 20 minutes, staring at the dashboard like it owed me an explanation, because something still wasn't sitting right in my stomach. Trent was a spoiled narcissist, sure. A grown man playing dress-up in his father's company, absolutely. But he had never once, in 11 months of watching him operate, struck me as careful. And the man I'd just watched get dismantled in that boardroom had left behind notarized paperwork, tangled offshore proxies, and a trail so clean it practically had arrows painted on it, pointing straight to his own name. That wasn't sloppiness. That was a man who'd been handed a shovel and told, gently, encouragingly, exactly where to dig his own grave. My phone buzzed. Unknown number again. This time, a voicemail. I sat in that parked car and listened to Vivian Ashcombe's voice, low, almost confessional, in a way I had never once heard her use in 7 years of knowing her professionally. "If you're hearing this, It means I'm probably already out of reach. I did what I had to do, Renata. That company was mine before Walter married it out from under me on paper. I needed a fall guy, and Trent, God help him, was built for the role, since the day he was born wanting my approval more than he ever wanted his own judgment. Don't look so shocked. You got exactly what you wanted. Take it. Walk away while the walking's good. I sat frozen in the driver's seat while the temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the August heat outside. She had used me. Every leaked photo, every whispered piece of intelligence, every perfectly timed text signed with a single letter. Vivian Ashcombe hadn't just wanted revenge. She wanted resurrection. And she had built the entire structure of it on the back of her own son, using me as the match she needed to set the whole thing burning. I drove straight to Solène's, her old meeting ground, the place she'd first slid 3 photographs across a linen tablecloth and rearranged my entire life. It was closed, too early for dinner service, chairs still upturned on tables through the front glass. But taped to the door, at exactly eye level, was a plain white envelope with my name written on it in that same looping cursive. Inside was a single page, signed and notarized, a transfer of ownership, 12% of Del Rio Holdings, from Vivian Ashcombe to me. No consideration listed, no conditions attached, just her signature and a date 3 days earlier, meaning she had prepared this before the boardroom meeting had even happened, before she could have known with certainty how any of it would land. I stood on that sidewalk with the paper trembling slightly in my hand, my heart going like a war drum, doing math I didn't want to do. 51% from my own acquisition, 12% now from her. I owned 63% of Del Rio Casework Group, alone. No partners left standing, no backers waiting in the wings with strings attached. I called the number she'd texted me from. Disconnected. I checked the shell trust she'd used to route her original 5% stake into the company. Emptied, dissolved, wiped clean, as if it had never existed. I called 2 people who'd known her socially for decades. Nothing. No sightings, no social presence, no burner line anyone could trace. Vivian Ashcombe had burned every trace of herself out of the ledger a second time in her life, and left me holding an empire I hadn't entirely asked for. The silence where she used to be was, in its own strange way, louder than anything she'd ever said to my face. I want to back up here because I don't think any of what happened next makes sense unless you understand what those 14 years at Ashcombe and Vale actually were to me. Not a resume line, not a stepping stone, but the place I had built my entire adult identity inside of, brick by brick, the way you build a house you fully intend to grow old in. I started there at 32, 3 years out of a supply chain graduate program I'd paid for by working nights at a freight brokerage, newly married to Daniel, newly convinced I understood how the world of global logistics actually worked. I did not, as it turned out, understand anything yet. My first year, I nearly tanked an entire holiday season by underestimating peak shipping congestion out of a single port in Long Beach, a mistake that cost the company almost $2 million in expedited air freight and cost me 3 months of feeling like a fraud who talked her way into a job she didn't deserve. Walter Ashcombe, to his credit, back when he still occasionally showed flashes of the man who'd once actually built something instead of merely inheriting the right to run it, called me into his office after that disaster instead of firing me. "Everyone who's any good at this job has a story like yours," he told me. "The question isn't whether you'll make the mistake. It's whether you'll still be standing here in 5 years to make a better one." I decided, sitting in that office at 32 years old, that I would be standing there in 5 years. I ended up standing there for 14. I rebuilt our entire sourcing map twice. Once after a factory fire in Vietnam wiped out 40% of our upholstery capacity overnight, and once during the early months of a global pandemic that broke supply chains the way an earthquake breaks a city's water mains. All at once, everywhere, with no warning and no manual. During that second rebuild, my father was dying 2 states away in a hospice facility I could only visit on weekends because someone had to keep $40 million of stranded inventory from becoming a total loss. And there was, at that particular moment, only one someone who actually understood the whole system well enough to do it. I remember sitting in a Marriott outside Louisville at 2 in the morning, rerouting 3 container ships through a spreadsheet lit up by hotel lamp, while 300 miles away, a hospice nurse held my father's hand because I couldn't be in 2 places that mattered at the same time. I brokered the deal that saved our Q3 numbers that year. Nobody outside a small circle of people ever knew what it cost me personally to do it. I never told them. That wasn't the culture there. You didn't bring your grief to the boardroom. You brought your spreadsheets, and you were quietly, privately proud of yourself for managing to produce both at once. I trained half the buyers who sat in that Tuesday morning meeting and watched a 29-year-old with a trust fund and a jawline call my work overhead without a single one of them looking up from their laptops. I tell you all of this not to ask for sympathy, though I suppose some is probably fair, but because I think it matters that you understand what Vivian Ashcombe actually took when she decided to use me as a weapon. It wasn't just my time, or my severance, or 6 exhausting weeks of my life. It was the version of the story where all of that sacrifice belonged entirely to me, where I got to be the architect of my own comeback instead of a very well-compensated instrument in someone else's. I'd love to tell you the story ended there, with a tidy transfer of ownership and a sidewalk revelation and a slow fade to credits. It didn't. 3 weeks after Trent's resignation hit the wires, while I was still learning the actual, unglamorous, spreadsheet-heavy work of running a manufacturing company instead of merely supplying one, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. Subject line simply, "We should discuss what I know." It was Preston Cole, Trent's former financial advisor, the man from the 4 a.m. photograph, the man whose spine Vivian had once described, not inaccurately, as beige curtain material. Turns out beige curtains can still hang you, given the right window. Preston had, in the process of structuring Trent's failed acquisition attempt, obtained copies of documents relating to the exact same shell entities Vivian had used to route her 5% stake into Del Rio before I ever knew her name was attached to any of it. And buried in those documents, apparently, was a detail that had escaped even my attorney's very thorough review. The original funding source for Vivian's initial position in the company, 3 years before any of this began, had come from an account connected, loosely, deniably, but not invisibly, to a lawsuit settlement Ashcombe and Vail had paid to make an old sexual harassment claim against a since-departed executive quietly disappear. In other words, Vivian Ashcombe had funded part of her secret war chest with hush money that had originally been paid to protect the company from a scandal that predated any of us. Preston wanted $50,000 and a permanent consulting contract with Del Rio in exchange for making sure that detail never found its way to a journalist who'd recently started sniffing around the Ashcombe family's messier corners. I did not pay him. Instead, I called Naomi, and together we did something I suspect surprised Preston more than any lawsuit ever could have. We got ahead of it. I drafted a short, factual internal memo. Not a press release, not a public statement, just a clean, documented account of the funding trail, handed voluntarily to Ashcombe and Vale's own general counsel, along with a note that read, in full, "I believe you'll want to review this before anyone else does. It turns out there is very little more disarming to a blackmailer than watching the person he's threatening simply walk into the light he was planning to drag them into." Walter Ashcombe called me himself 2 days later, the first time he'd used my direct line in years. "You didn't have to tell us that," he said, and I could hear, for possibly the first time in 14 years, something that sounded almost like respect in his voice instead of just authority. "No," I agreed, "but I've spent enough of my life cleaning up other people's messes, quietly, in the dark, so somebody else could take credit for the outcome. I wasn't going to start doing it for myself." Preston Cole was quietly, thoroughly, and permanently removed from any relationship with either company within the week. I never heard from him again. I did, briefly, feel something close to gratitude toward Vivian for having taught me, however manipulatively, exactly how leverage worked, because it turned out the same lesson that had once been used against me was the one that let me disarm the next person who tried it. If I thought the hardest part was behind me, the universe apparently disagreed, because that's roughly when the Sable Group came calling. Sable was a private equity outfit out of Chicago that specialized in a very specific, very unglamorous strategy. Find a small manufacturer that had just survived a public, headline-adjacent ownership fight, wait for the new owner to be exhausted and financially overextended, and offer just enough money to make walking away feel like relief instead of surrender. Their opening call came from a man named Harlan Voss, who introduced himself with the easy confidence of someone who had made this exact call 200 times and won it 180 of them. "We think Del Rio is an incredible asset," he told me, "and we think you've earned the right to exit at the top instead of grinding through years of operational headache to prove a point nobody outside your industry will ever fully appreciate." It was, I'll admit, a genuinely good pitch. I had, after all, just spent my severance, liquidated an investment, and borrowed against my late sister's trust to fund a controlling stake in a Mexican furniture manufacturer I had zero prior experience actually operating day to day. The number Sable eventually offered, nearly triple what I'd paid in, all cash, no earnout, no strings, would have let Daniel and me pay off our house, fund both our niece's college accounts, and never think about container shipping rates again for the rest of our lives. I sat with that offer for 4 days. I ran the numbers 11 different ways. I had a long, quiet conversation with Daniel on our back porch one night, where he told me, gently, that he would love me exactly the same whether I took the money or not, which is the kind of thing that either means everything or nothing, depending entirely on how you receive it. And that night, at least, it meant everything. What finally decided it wasn't the money, and it wasn't pride either. It was a phone call from Mateo Del Rio, the man who'd sold me his majority stake in a break room with a dying coffee maker, who told me, not pleading, just informing me, the way he'd tell me about a shipment delay, that Sable's operating model, in every other acquisition they'd made in his industry, involved consolidating 3 or 4 regional factories into one efficiency hub within 18 months, which was corporate language for laying off roughly 60% of the workforce at each site that wasn't chosen. "I sold to you because you asked me about my workers before you asked me about my margins," Mateo said. "I'd like it if that was still true a year from now." I turned Sable down the following morning. Harlan Voss seemed genuinely baffled, which I found strangely satisfying. A man who had built a career on the assumption that everyone, eventually, has a number, discovering that mine simply hadn't been for sale in the way he'd priced it. Turning down Sable's offer meant something had to change, though, because word of the offer, and my refusal, had already traveled through Del Rio's workforce faster than any memo I could have written, and it had traveled in the worst possible form: rumor. By the time I flew down to Guadalajara 2 weeks later, half the floor believed I'd already sold and was simply coming to deliver the news in person out of some misplaced sense of decency. I asked Mateo to gather everyone who could take a break from the line, nearly 300 people, crammed into the main assembly floor between two idle CNC routers, translators positioned at both ends of the room because my Spanish, 14 years of trying, remained stubbornly workable but far from fluent. I told them the truth, that I had been offered an enormous amount of money to sell the company, and that I had turned it down, and that I wanted them to understand exactly why, because I had spent a large chunk of my own career on the other side of exactly this kind of decision, watching executives choose numbers over people, and dress it up in language about efficiency and transformation. "I know some of you have heard that word before," I said, and let the translator catch up, watching faces in the crowd, some skeptical, arms crossed, the particular posture of people who have been promised things by executives in nice blazers before. Transformation. In my experience, it usually means someone in a much nicer office than mine has already decided who gets cut, and they just haven't told you yet. I'm not here to tell you that. I'm here to tell you, I don't know exactly what the next 2 years look like. I do know I'm not selling this company to anyone whose plan for it starts with cutting 60% of the people who actually build the thing we sell. Somebody near the back, a woman named Carmen, I'd learn later, who'd worked the finishing line for 19 years, asked, through the translator, the only question that actually mattered. And in 5 years? When we're not new anymore? When this isn't a story anyone's telling? What happens then? I didn't have a perfect answer, and I told her so. I don't know exactly what happens in 5 years. I know what I'm building toward. I'd like you to hold me to it. It wasn't a rousing speech. Nobody cheered, but 300 people went back to work that afternoon instead of quietly updating their resumes, and Carmen, 6 months later, would be the one to walk me through a redesigned finishing process that cut waste by 11% and became the single biggest efficiency win of my first year running the company, a fact I mention not to wrap this chapter in a neat little bow, but because it's true, and because it's the closest thing to proof I have that doing the harder, slower, more human thing occasionally also turns out to be the smarter business decision, even if that was never actually why I made it. Word travels strangely inside a company that's just survived a very public founder-son implosion. Some people, understandably, kept their heads down and stayed exactly where they were, waiting to see which way the wind would ultimately settle before making any decision that might follow them onto a future resume. Others called me. The first was Priya Anand, who had run Ashcombe & Vale's logistics analytics team for 6 years and had, in that time, built a demand forecasting model so accurate that our warehouse teams used to joke it could predict a customer's return before the customer had finished unboxing the couch. She called me on a Sunday, 4 weeks after Trent's resignation, and didn't bother with small talk. "Is there a job for me over there, or am I about to make an extremely awkward phone call for nothing?" There was a job for her. There was, as it turned out, a job for almost anyone who called. Because building a manufacturing operation into something closer to a full, vertically integrated supply chain required exactly the kind of talent Ashcombe & Vale had spent years accumulating and had just spent one very bad month actively driving away. The second call came from someone I genuinely hadn't expected. Devin Marsh, the operations lead whose panicked warning had reached me through a junior analyst back in the earliest days of the fight, back when half the company believed I was a vindictive former employee trying to burn the whole building down out of spite. Devin had watched the entire thing unfold from inside, had watched Trent freeze vendor payments and lawyer up and eventually get walked out by security, and he called me not to ask for a job, but to apologize. "I should have believed you instead of the panic," he said. "For what it's worth, I get it now. I just wanted you to know that." I hired him anyway, 2 months later, when his own position at Ashcombe & Vale got quietly folded into a restructuring that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a company still trying to figure out who it was without without an Ashcombe standing at the front of every room. By the time 6 months had passed, I had poached, by my own count, 11 people from my former employer, none of whom I'd actively recruited, all of whom had simply looked at the wreckage Trent left behind and decided they'd rather build something new with someone who'd once fought publicly and successfully for the idea that expertise still mattered more than a last name. Somewhere around month 2, a business journalist named Farah Okonkwo, who covered mid-market manufacturing for a trade outlet with more influence than its modest subscriber count would suggest, published a piece titled "The Quiet Coup: How a Fired Executive Bought Her Way Back into Power." It was, on the whole, more flattering than accurate, which I've come to understand is simply what happens when your life becomes content. The comments underneath it were a strange, whiplash-inducing mix. Half the responses treated me like a folk hero. "Female exec dismantles nepotism, one freight contract at a time," was an actual line someone wrote. And I'll admit I screenshotted it and sent it to Daniel with 3 exclamation points. Because even a woman trying very hard to stay grounded is still allowed one moment of vanity. The other half were considerably less kind. Versions of the same argument dressed up in different outfits. That I'd used private information obtained during my employment. That the speed of the Del Rio deal implied premeditation bordering on disloyalty. That whatever legitimate grievance I'd had against Trent didn't excuse turning a former employer's own supply chain into a weapon against it. I want to be honest with you here, because I think a story like this one is only worth telling if I don't sand off the parts that make me look complicated. Some of that criticism wasn't entirely wrong. I had been quietly negotiating to buy Del Rio for 6 months before Trent ever called me overhead in that meeting. Which meant, if I'm being fully honest with myself, in a way I hadn't quite managed to be during the adrenaline of it all, that some part of me had already sensed which way the wind was blowing, long before he confirmed it out loud. I had seen budget memos. I had heard whispers about leadership refresh initiatives, months before Trent ever set foot in the building. I had started protecting myself before anyone had officially threatened me. And there's a version of this story where that makes me strategic, and another version where it makes me someone who'd already quietly decided to leave and needed a villain dramatic enough to justify the exit to herself. Both of those things can be true at once. I've stopped pretending otherwise. 6 months after his resignation, I ran into Trent Ashcombe at a gas station off the interstate, of all the anticlimactic places for a final confrontation to happen. He was pumping gas into a car that was noticeably less expensive than the one he'd driven when he still had his father's company paying for it, wearing a hoodie instead of a quarter zip, looking, for the first time since I'd met him, like an actual 29-year-old person instead of a costume of executive confidence stretched over one. He saw me before I could decide whether to pretend I hadn't seen him first. For a second, neither of us said anything, the pump humming between us, a truck idling somewhere behind the building. "I looked stupid," he finally said. Not an apology exactly. Closer to a confession delivered to the wrong audience because there wasn't a better one available. You did some stupid things, I said. There's a difference, if it matters to you. He almost laughed, a short, unhappy sound. My mother called me 2 days before that board meeting. Told me Del Rio was vulnerable. Told me exactly which entity structure to use. Told me it'd make my father finally take me seriously. His jaw worked. I didn't even think to ask why she knew any of that. I just wanted him to look at me the way he looks at a spreadsheet. I stood there holding the gas pump handle, watching a grown man realize, apparently for the very first time, and 6 months too late to matter, that he had never once been the strategist in his own story. He had been a tool, being used by someone with a much longer memory and a much older grievance, exactly the way I very nearly had been. For what it's worth, he said, screwing his gas cap back on, not quite meeting my eyes. I don't think what I said about you in that meeting was ever really about you. I think I just needed someone in that room to be smaller than me, because everyone in my life had spent my whole childhood making sure I never had to feel small on my own. It wasn't an excuse. I didn't take it as one. But it was, I think, the single most honest sentence I ever heard him say, and it sat with me longer than I expected it to on the drive home. Not because it changed what he'd done, but because it was the first time I understood that Trent Ashcombe hadn't been the villain of this story so much as its first casualty, cracked open years before I ever walked into that Tuesday meeting, by a family that had been fighting a war over a company long before either of us had any real stake in the outcome. By the 8-month mark, Del Rio Casework Group was, by every external measure, thriving in a way that would have seemed absurd to predict a year earlier. Clients who had once ignored my emails when I was simply the supply chain director at their vendor's biggest customer were now calling to beg for capacity. I had renegotiated 4 shipping corridors, automated nearly 60% of the routing system that used to run on a logistics manager's memory and a whiteboard, and, as I mentioned earlier, poached 11 people from my old company, most of whom now ran teams considerably larger and better resourced than the ones they'd left behind. The empire was thriving. I was, by any reasonable standard, winning. And yet every single morning, walking into an office that had my name on the ownership documents and nobody else's, I didn't feel like a queen finally claiming her throne. I felt like a caretaker, guarding something built partly out of blood that wasn't entirely mine. Vivian's blood, in the sense of what she'd sacrificed and what she'd been willing to sacrifice of other people to get it back. Trent's, in the sense of a young man's public unraveling that I had, whatever the justification, actively engineered. And mine, in every quiet 3 a.m. moment I spent wondering whether the woman who'd built this out of righteous fury and the woman who'd once counted grout cracks in a bathroom stall to keep from crying were still underneath it all the same person. None of us, if I'm honest, came out of this clean. Then, on a late Friday night, just as I was shutting my laptop down for the weekend, an envelope arrived by courier. No return address, just my name, written in blue ink I recognized instantly. Inside were 2 things. The first item was a photograph, old and faded at the corners in the way photographs get when they've been carried, not stored. Vivian, considerably younger, propped up in a hospital bed, smiling the exhausted, luminous smile of a woman who has just done the hardest physical thing of her life. A newborn swaddled tightly against her chest. The handwritten tag clipped to the blanket, barely legible, read, Trent Ashcombe, 8 pounds, 2 ounces, March 1997. The second item was a letter. Renata, you were always meant to run something real. I don't say that to flatter you. I say it because I recognized it the first year I watched you work, back when you were still junior enough that nobody important had noticed you yet except me. I couldn't get back what I lost without breaking a few things on the way, and I want to be honest that I knew, going in, that one of the things most likely to break was my own son. He wasn't always what you saw in that meeting room. I want you to know that, even though I understand it changes nothing about what he did or what it cost you. Power simply doesn't forgive softness, and Walter raised him to believe that softness was the only thing standing between him and being taken seriously. I should have protected him from that lesson. Instead, when the moment came, I used it. I did what I had to do. You did what you had to do. We both carry ghosts now, and I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending mine weighs less than yours. Here is my final gift, and it comes with no more strings attached, no more shadows waiting behind it. You lead now. It's entirely, completely yours. Please, for both our sakes, don't become me. V. I sat in my office chair until the sun came up, that photograph resting in my hands like it had a pulse of its own. I could have sold the company that week, taken Sable's number or one very much like it, and disappeared the way Vivian had twice managed to disappear, leaving behind nothing but a folder and a legend. I could have scaled it aggressively, chasing growth for its own sake the way Trent's failed acquisition scheme had always secretly wanted to. I could have kept running the whole operation exactly the way I'd built it during the fight. Sharp, defensive, always one move ahead, treating every relationship like a potential trap, because that's the only mode my nervous system had known for 6 months straight. I didn't do any of those things. Monday morning, I walked into Del Rio's boardroom alone. No attorney, no allies, no carefully rehearsed evidence folder waiting to detonate across a table. Just me, and the particular kind of silence Vivian Ashcombe leaves in every room she's ever chosen to walk out of. I pulled up the quarterly report on the screen, looked each of my 6 new department heads in the eye, Priya, Devon, Carmen, who'd flown up from Guadalajara for the meeting, her first time seeing snow as it happened, and considerably more excited about that than about the report, and 3 others who joined in the previous 8 months. And I said the only sentence that actually mattered. I'm not here to play queen of anything. I'm here to build something that no man, no son, no ghost from anybody's past gets to burn down again. That includes mine. Nobody cheered, exactly, the way nobody had cheered on that assembly floor in Guadalajara months earlier. But they nodded, slowly, the specific nod of people deciding in real time to trust a direction rather than simply follow a title. And the room belonged to me in a way it never quite had during the 6 frantic weeks of the fight itself. Not because I'd inherited it from Vivian, not because I'd taken it from Trent, but because I had, finally, actually earned it, in the unglamorous, compounding Tuesday morning way that earning something usually actually happens, long after the dramatic part of the story is over. Somewhere out there, in whatever corner of the world Vivian Ashcombe had chosen to disappear into for the second and, I suspect, final time, I hope she's found something like peace. The woman she used to build her own resurrection is gone. What's left in her place is someone else entirely, and she's only just getting started. A year to the week after Trent Ashcombe stood at the front of a conference room and called 14 years of my work legacy overhead, I stood at the front of a very different room. An industry conference in Dallas, 300 people in folding chairs instead of 41 in office chairs, giving a keynote I had agreed to only after my publicist, a woman named Rosalind, whom I'd hired mostly to stop journalists from calling my personal cell phone at dinner, insisted it would be good for the brand. I hadn't planned to talk about Trent at all. I'd planned a fairly dry, competent talk about nearshoring trends and the fragility of single supplier dependency. The kind of talk that gets polite applause and 3 LinkedIn posts nobody reads past the first line. But somewhere around the Q&A, a young woman near the back, she couldn't have been older than 26, wearing the specific, over-prepared blazer of someone attending her first major industry event, raised her hand and asked, "How do you know when it's time to stop being loyal to a company that isn't being loyal back?" The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when somebody's asked the real question underneath all the polite ones. I told her the truth, or as close to it as I could manage on a stage with a wireless microphone clipped to my collar. I told her that loyalty is supposed to be a two-way contract, and that most of us are trained, especially women, especially in industries that run on the appearance of being agreeable, to keep paying our half of that contract long after the other party has quietly stopped paying theirs. I told her that the year I finally noticed the imbalance in my own contract was, not coincidentally, the same year I finally started building something of my own, instead of just maintaining something that belonged to somebody else's family name. I didn't tell her to go buy her employer's supplier out from under them. That's a fairly specific piece of advice, with a fairly specific set of prerequisites most people don't have. A manufacturing partner mid-divorce, a dead sister's trust fund, a marriage stable enough to survive 6 weeks of financial terror, and, frankly, an ex-wife somewhere quietly orchestrating half the plan from the shadows. I told her, instead, the more useful and considerably less cinematic version. Notice the moment the contract stops being mutual. Start planning before you're desperate, not after. And never let anyone convince you that the size of your severance package is the same thing as the size of your value. She wrote something down. I don't know what. I like to imagine it was useful. I've told you a great deal about what happened in boardrooms and gas stations and factory floors, and comparatively little about the person who was actually there for all of it at 3 a.m, which feels like an oversight worth correcting. Daniel and I had been married 19 years by the time Trent Ashcombe called me overhead. He is an architect, not a numbers person, which meant that for the entire 6-week fight, he mostly served as the person who reminded me to eat actual meals and occasionally hid my phone for an hour so I'd stop refreshing my email at midnight. He never once told me to slow down, and he never once told me I was being reckless. Even during the week I liquidated a decade-old investment and borrowed against my dead sister's trust in the space of about 11 hours, which is, by any objective measure, the single most financially unhinged week of our entire marriage. I asked him once, months later, over dinner, why he never pushed back on any of it. He thought about it for a while. Daniel thinks before he answers things, which is one of roughly 400 reasons I married him, and finally said, "Because I watched you build that supply chain for 14 years, and I watched what it cost you every single time somebody else got credit for it. When you finally decided to stop letting that happen, I wasn't going to be the person standing in the doorway asking if you'd really thought it through. You'd thought about almost nothing else for 6 months. My job wasn't to slow you down. My job was to make sure you had dinner." He did use Colette's trust as a bit of leverage in one argument, exactly once, about 6 weeks after the dust settled, when I was seriously considering pouring an enormous additional sum into a factory expansion that even Matteo thought was premature. "Your sister would want you to actually build something with that money," he said, "not just survive with it." I scaled the expansion back by 40% that week, which turned out, a year later, to have been the correct call, and which I mention here mostly because I think it's important in a story this dramatic to remember that the quiet, undramatic corrections are usually the ones that actually save you. 14 months in, Carmen, the finishing line worker who'd asked me the hardest question in that Guadalajara warehouse, the one about what happens in 5 years when the story stops being a story, walked into my office with a proposal she'd built entirely on her own time, using a laptop her daughter had helped her learn to use 6 months earlier. It was a redesign of our sanding and finishing process that would cut material waste by an estimated 11% and reduce the physical strain injuries that had quietly plagued that line for years. The kind of injuries nobody files an official complaint about because the job pays better than most alternatives in the region, and everyone assumes sore wrists are simply the cost of admission. I approved it in the meeting, on the spot, which apparently was not how proposals had traditionally been handled at Del Rio before I arrived, based on the surprised look on both Carmen's face and Mateo's when he heard about it secondhand an hour later. We implemented it over 6 weeks. It worked exactly as well as she'd projected, and I promoted her to floor supervisor for the entire finishing department 3 months after that, the first woman to hold that title in the company's history, a fact that took me an embarrassingly long time to notice, given how much of my own story had been built on exactly that kind of overlooked and underestimated foundation. I think about that meeting often, actually, more than I think about the boardroom confrontation with Trent, because it's the moment that convinced me I hadn't simply traded one corporate power structure for a slightly smaller, angrier version of the same thing. Carmen's line is, to this day, the most efficient in the building. She reports directly to Priya now. Her daughter, the one who taught her to use a laptop, started an internship with us the following summer, in the same analytics department Priya runs, which is either a lovely coincidence or the entire point of building something worth staying at, depending on how sentimental you're willing to let me be about my own company. 18 months after Trent's resignation, Walter Ashcombe called me, his own hand, not an assistant's, a fact I noted the way you note any small, unprecedented thing from a man who'd spent 14 years never once dialing my extension himself. "I'd like to talk about a supply agreement," he said, with none of the pleasantries that usually preceded actual business at that level. "Formal terms this time. No ownership stakes, no restructuring games, just the straightforward arrangement we probably should have had from the beginning, before my son decided he needed to reinvent something that was already working." We met in person at a restaurant that was, deliberately I think, neither Solen's nor anywhere either of us had history with. He looked older than I remembered, which 18 months and a very public family scandal will do to a person, and he spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting doing something I had genuinely never once seen him do in 14 years of working together. He asked me questions about myself that weren't strictly business relevant. How Daniel was, whether I still ran, which I'd mentioned once, years earlier, in an elevator that he apparently remembered. Near the end of the meal, he set down his glass and said, without much preamble, "I want you to know I didn't know what Vivian was doing. Any of it. I found out the same day the board did." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, though I noticed he hadn't actually apologized for anything he had known about. The culture that made Trent believe cruelty was the same thing as leadership. The years he'd spent letting a woman who'd co-built his entire company get erased from its own history for the crime of an inconvenient divorce. We signed the supply agreement 2 weeks later. It's a good contract. Fair terms, market rates, none of the leverage games either of our companies had spent the previous year and a half playing against each other. I won't pretend it healed anything between us, because I don't think either of us was under the illusion it was meant to. But it turns out you can do good, mutually beneficial business with someone without needing to forgive them. And I think that particular lesson took me considerably longer to learn than the supply chain ever did. I never spoke to Vivian Ashcombe again after that voicemail and the envelope taped to Solen's door. But I did, eventually, find out roughly where she'd gone, In the roundabout way, you eventually find out most things about people who've decided to disappear on purpose. A colleague of mine, a woman named Iris who ran procurement for one of our newer European clients, mentioned almost in passing, at a trade dinner 2 years after everything had settled, that she'd once worked briefly for a boutique brand consultancy outside Lisbon, run by a formidable, silver-haired American woman who went by a name that wasn't quite Vivian, but was close enough. Viv Ashworth, apparently, who took on exactly 3 clients a year, all of them founder-led companies in the middle of some kind of leadership crisis, and who was, according to Iris, terrifyingly good, in a way that made you wonder what she'd actually done before this. I never reached out to confirm it was her. Part of me suspects I already know it is, and part of me has decided that some doors are better left exactly as closed as the person on the other side of them chose to leave them. I think about her more than I probably should, given everything. Not with anger, exactly. That faded faster than I expected it to. Somewhere around the time Carmen got promoted, and I realized how much of the good that had come out of this whole mess had grown in soil Vivian had, however manipulatively, helped till. But with something closer to a wary, complicated gratitude. The kind you feel toward a storm that flattened your house, but also, in doing so, revealed a foundation underneath it that turned out to be sturdier than the house itself had ever let you see. About 2 years in, I hired someone I probably shouldn't have, on paper. Her name was Yasmin Delgado, 24 years old, 2 years out of a state school with a supply chain certificate instead of a degree from anywhere impressive. A resume with an 8-month gap, she explained, unprompted and with a directness I found immediately likable, as, I was taking care of my mother during chemo, and I'm not going to pretend that gap doesn't exist or apologize for it. Priya, running our hiring process by that point, had flagged her as underqualified for the logistics coordinator role we were filling. I overrode that flag myself, because something about the directness of that explanation reminded me, uncomfortably and specifically, of a 32-year-old version of myself explaining to Walter Ashcombe exactly how badly I'd misjudged port congestion during my first holiday season, and being given, against the odds, a chance to prove that mistake wasn't the whole story. Yasmin has been with us 14 months now. She is, by Priya's own admission, one of the 3 best analysts on the team, and she has a habit of staying 45 minutes after her shift most days, not because anyone asks her to, but because, her words, not mine. I want to actually understand the whole system, not just my piece of it, which is, verbatim, the exact sentence I remember thinking to myself during my own first year at Ashcombe & Vale, 23 years and 1 lifetime ago. I don't tell this story to pat myself on the back for a single good hire. I tell it because I think it's the clearest evidence I have that something genuinely different got built here, underneath all the drama and the lawsuits and the envelopes taped to restaurant doors. A place willing to bet on the 8-month gap instead of automatically filtering it out. Because someone, once, took exactly that same bet on me. None of this, I should be clear, was ever a smooth upward line on a chart. The closest we came to genuinely losing everything wasn't Trent, and it wasn't Sable, and it wasn't even the lawsuit. It was a hurricane. 18 months into running Del Rio, a storm system that had been downgraded, then upgraded again with almost insulting speed, made landfall near one of our 2 secondary port contacts on the Gulf, the one we used specifically as backup for the primary route out of Manzanillo whenever seasonal congestion got bad. It knocked out power to the port facility for 9 days and put roughly 3 weeks of finished inventory, including the entire fall order for 2 of our largest new clients, in a warehouse with a compromised roof and, for about 11 of the worst hours of my professional life, no confirmed insurance coverage. because the policy renewal paperwork had been sitting, unsigned, in a queue somewhere between our broker and Del Rio's newly hired risk manager, who had started 4 days before the storm and had, understandably, not yet gotten to it. I found out about the gap in coverage at 11 at night from an email that made my stomach drop the way very few emails ever have, including, I'll be honest, the actual lawsuit from Trent's attorneys. 3 weeks of inventory, uninsured, sitting under a compromised roof, representing roughly the entire operating margin we'd need to survive the next quarter if it went wrong. I called Matteo. I called our broker. I called a structural engineer at midnight who I am fairly sure had never once in his career received a call that late from a furniture company. And then I did the thing that 14 years at Ashcombe and Vale had actually, genuinely trained me to do better than almost anything else. I ran the numbers, isolated the actual controllable variables inside an overwhelming, mostly uncontrollable disaster, and made a series of small, precise decisions instead of one large, panicked one. We tarped the compromised section of roof by 4 the next morning, using a crew Matteo found through a cousin. We moved the 2 most time-sensitive client orders to a rented refrigerated truck fleet, expensive, absurd for furniture, but dry within 6 hours. We got the insurance paperwork retroactively bound by that afternoon, through a broker relationship I'd maintained almost accidentally from my Ashcombe and Vale days, who did me a favor she absolutely did not have to do. We lost about 4% of that quarter's inventory to water damage. It could have been closer to 60. I didn't sleep properly for 11 days, and I cried exactly once, alone in a rental car in a Home Depot parking lot in Corpus Christi, from a combination of exhaustion and the specific, delayed terror of realizing how close we'd come to losing everything I'd risked my sister's memory and my marriage's financial stability to build. I tell you this story not because it has a villain in it, or a boardroom, or a satisfying reveal. I tell it because I think stories like mine, the ones that get turned into a video or an article or, apparently, whatever this document eventually becomes, tend to make it look like the dramatic human versus human conflict is the real test of whether you deserve what you've built. It isn't. Not really. The real test showed up on a Tuesday night with no plot and no villain at all. Just a bad roof and a paperwork gap. And it was considerably scarier than anything Trent Ashcombe or his mother ever engineered on purpose. I know some of you reading this are going to want the actual figures because I would, so here they are, as plainly as I can lay them out without turning this into an investor deck. Del Rio Casework Group, at the time I acquired my controlling stake, generated roughly $31 million in annual revenue, almost entirely from a single client relationship, Ashcombe and Vale, which is precisely the kind of concentration risk that should have terrified me and, in hindsight, absolutely did, somewhere underneath the adrenaline. Within 2 years, we diversified to 11 active wholesale clients, none of whom individually represented more than 18% of revenue, and grown total annual revenue to just under $58 million, largely by doing the unglamorous work of being reliable in an industry where reliability has become, unfortunately, a genuine competitive advantage rather than a baseline expectation. Headcount at the Guadalajara facility grew from around 210 people to just over 340, including the opening of a second, smaller finishing facility 11 months in, the expansion Daniel talked me into scaling back by 40%, which in retrospect was exactly the right amount of ambition for that particular year. Average wages across the facility rose 14% over that same period, not out of pure altruism, I'll be honest, but because retaining workers like Carmen, who understood systems nobody else fully did, turned out to be dramatically cheaper than constantly retraining new ones, which is a lesson I wish more executives who talk endlessly about legacy overhead would eventually learn. None of these numbers make for a dramatic video moment. Nobody's slamming a folder onto a boardroom table over an 11% waste reduction. But this is, if I'm honest, the actual substance of what happened after the dramatic part ended. Years of unglamorous, compounding decisions that turned a chaotic 6-week revenge story into an actual, sustainable business, which is a distinction I think gets lost whenever stories like mine get compressed down into their most cinematic 10 minutes. If you've watched enough of these stories, the ones about the overlooked executive, the smug heir, the folder full of receipts pulled out at exactly the right moment, you already know there's always a contingent of people who show up afterward with the same handful of questions. So let me just answer them directly, since I've had 2 years to think about the answers properly instead of defending myself in real time. Was it fair to Trent? No, probably not entirely, if we're being precise about the word fair. He said something cruel and stupid in a meeting, and he paid a price wildly disproportionate to that single sentence. Though I'd gently point out that the price he actually paid came from his own fraud, not from my acquisition of Del Rio, which would have happened regardless of whether he'd ever opened his mouth about legacy overhead at all. I didn't create his crimes. I created the conditions under which they finally had nowhere left to hide. Was I angry the whole time? Underneath the calm? Yes, constantly. I want to be honest that the version of me who signed that severance agreement with a steady hand and walked out smiling was not some Zen master of emotional regulation. She was a woman running almost entirely on rage and 14 years of practice hiding it, because that particular skill, staying outwardly composed while something in you is quietly on fire, is one that women in corporate environments get forced to master a great deal earlier and a great deal more thoroughly than most of our male colleagues ever have to. Do I regret using Vivian's intelligence, knowing what I know now about how she used me? No. I regret not asking harder questions sooner about where that intelligence was actually coming from. Those are different things, and I think conflating them lets people off the hook for the second one by pretending it's really about the first. And the question I get most often, in one form or another: would I do it again? I would. Not identically. I'd ask Vivian more questions earlier. I'd probably have Naomi review Mateo's original term sheet a full week sooner than I did. And I would absolutely, without hesitation, buy better coffee for that break room in the industrial park south of the city. But the fundamental shape of the decision, to stop absorbing someone else's contempt quietly and start building something that couldn't be taken from me by a man half my age reading off a script somebody else handed him. I would make that decision again on any given Tuesday at any given company for the rest of my working life. I haven't told you very much about my sister, and I think that's a gap worth filling before this story ends. Because her trust fund isn't just a plot device in the way it might read on the page. It was the hardest single decision of the entire 6 weeks. Harder than the acquisition itself, harder than the lawsuit, harder even than realizing Vivian had used me. Colette was 3 years younger than me, and she died of an aggressive, poorly understood autoimmune condition 11 years ago, after a decade of misdiagnoses that I still, on my worst nights, blame at least partly on a healthcare system that took considerably longer to believe a woman describing her own pain than it would have taken to believe a man. She never married, never had children, and left behind a modest but carefully managed trust, the result of 2 decades working as a marine biologist on a government salary and living, by her own choice, well beneath her means, with a single stipulation attached that our parents, both gone by then as well, had helped her write into the paperwork. The money was to be used only in service of something she would have called, in her characteristically blunt way, actually building something, not just getting by. I had touched that trust exactly once before, 3 years after she died, to help fund my father's hospice care during the same terrible year I was simultaneously rerouting container ships from a Marriott outside Louisville. I swore, standing at her grave that following spring, that I would never touch it again unless the reason was worthy of her actual standard. Not comfort, not convenience, but building. When I sat in my kitchen the weekend after Trent's public humiliation, running the numbers on Del Rio, I thought about her stipulation more than I thought about almost anything else in that entire decision. Buying a controlling stake in a mid-sized Mexican furniture manufacturer to escape corporate humiliation and enact a complicated revenge plot against my former employer's golden boy heir did not, on its face, sound like the kind of building Colette had in mind. But building 340 jobs, a wage increase, a promotion pathway for a woman like Carmen who'd spent 19 years on a finishing line without one, an internship for Carmen's daughter, a second chance for a 24-year-old with an 8-month gap in her resume. That, I decided, standing in my kitchen with her trust paperwork spread across the counter, was exactly the kind of building she would have recognized. I still visit her grave every year on the anniversary of that decision, not the anniversary of Trent's meeting. And I tell her, every year, exactly how the money got used, in specific, unglamorous detail, because I think she would have wanted the specifics more than the sentiment. I used to think, back during the 6 weeks when this all felt like a war, that winning would feel like a very particular thing, vindication mostly. The specific satisfaction of watching someone who'd underestimated me discover exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. And for about 4 days after that boardroom confrontation, it did feel like that, in flashes, usually late at night, when I'd replay Trent's face going tomato red and let myself enjoy it slightly more than I probably should admit to in a document like this one. But that feeling faded faster than I expected, and what replaced it wasn't triumph. It was responsibility, in a form so much heavier and less glamorous than I'd anticipated that it genuinely startled me. 340 people's livelihoods, eventually. A factory with an aging roof and an insurance policy I now personally double-check every single renewal cycle myself. No exceptions, no delegating that particular task to anyone, ever again. A sister's memory attached to every major financial decision I make. A marriage that had absorbed 6 weeks of genuine terror on my behalf and deserved, in return, a version of me who didn't stay in permanent battle mode just because battle mode had once, briefly, worked. Winning, it turns out, was never the boardroom moment. Winning was Carmen walking me through her redesigned finishing line 11 months later, explaining each change with the quiet confidence of someone who knows she's finally being heard. Winning was Yasmin staying 45 minutes late because she wanted to understand the whole system. Winning was Daniel, on our back porch, telling me he'd love me the same either way, and meaning it enough that the money genuinely stopped mattering the moment he said it. None of that would fit neatly into the 10 most dramatic minutes of a video about corporate revenge. I've made my peace with that. The dramatic 10 minutes got me in the door. Everything that actually mattered happened in the 2 years after the door closed behind me. I heard, secondhand, through Devin, who still kept in loose touch with a few people at Ashcombe and Vale, that Trent had eventually taken a job, a real one, entry-level, at a mid-sized regional furniture retailer in Ohio, working under a district manager who had no idea, or claimed to have no idea, who his father was. He apparently started at the bottom of an actual operations track, learning inventory systems and vendor relationships from the ground floor instead of being handed a title and a vague mandate to transform something he'd never bothered to understand. I don't know if that's a redemption story or simply a young man running out of other options and stumbling into the only structure left that could actually hold him. Maybe it doesn't matter which. Devon said he seemed, by all accounts, quieter, less certain of himself in a way that read, from a distance, less like defeat and more like the beginning of the same slow, unglamorous Tuesday morning kind of learning I'd gone through myself at 32, after I nearly tanked an entire holiday season and Walter Ashcombe, for one brief and uncharacteristic moment in an otherwise unremarkable career, decided to let me stay and get better instead of simply removing the mistake from his sight. I hope that's what's happening to Trent, somewhere in Ohio, learning a business from the floor up the way I once did. I don't especially need to know for certain. Some chapters of other people's stories aren't actually mine to finish. And I've come to believe that's true even of the people who once tried very hard to end mine. There is a strange, disorienting side effect to becoming, even briefly and in a fairly niche industry, a story that people tell each other. The trade press piece, then a slightly larger business podcast interview, then, apparently now, whatever platform this particular account of events ends up living on. People started recognizing my name in rooms before I'd introduced myself. A supplier I'd never met once opened a negotiation by saying, only half joking, "I've heard about you, so let's skip the part where I try to lowball you." It's flattering, some days. It's exhausting, most days, because the version of the story that circulates is always cleaner than the actual experience of living it. It skips the 11 a.m. panic in a rental car outside Corpus Christi, skips the 4 days I genuinely considered taking Sable's money and disappearing to somewhere with better weather and no supply chain crises whatsoever, skips the specific, private shame of realizing I'd been played by Vivian Ashcombe for 6 weeks before I ever fully understood the shape of what she was doing. I've had to make peace with being a slightly flattened, slightly more decisive version of myself in other people's retellings, because I think, on balance, the flattened version still does some good. It's the version that made that 26-year-old woman in Dallas ask her real question out loud, instead of a safer one. And it's the version that made Yasmin, apparently, mention in her interview that she'd read about Del Rio's approach to second chances and specifically wanted to work somewhere that operated that way. I'll take the flattening, most days, if it does that much work in the world. I just wanted you, reading the fuller version, to know what got left out. 3 years to the month after Trent Ashcombe called my work overhead in front of 41 silent colleagues, Del Rio Casework Group opened its third facility, a smaller, specialized upholstery shop about 90 minutes from the original Guadalajara plant, run day-to-day by a general manager who started, 18 months earlier, as a floor supervisor under Carmen's direct mentorship. We now supply 14 wholesale clients across North America, none of them representing more than 15% of total revenue, a diversification I still check obsessively every single quarter, because concentration risk is the one lesson from this entire saga I refuse to ever let myself unlearn. Annual revenue sits just north of $71 million. Headcount across all 3 facilities is approaching 410 people, including an apprenticeship program, modeled loosely on the one that gave Carmen's daughter her start, that now runs 8 participants a year. I still fly to Guadalajara myself at least once a quarter, not because anyone requires it of me anymore, but because I learned, the hard way, exactly what happens to a company the moment its owner starts believing spreadsheets can substitute for actually standing on the floor. Mateo, technically retired now, still shows up most Fridays anyway. Mostly, he tells me, for the coffee, though we both know the coffee remains genuinely terrible, and he simply likes being near what he built long enough to see it outlast him. I think about the word Trent used more than I think about almost anything else from that whole period. More even than the boardroom confrontation, or the voicemail, or the envelope taped to a restaurant door. Overhead. Legacy overhead, specifically. As if 14 years of preventing catastrophes he'd never even hear about was simply weight the company was dragging around out of sentiment, rather than the actual structural foundation holding up everything he was standing on when he said it. I looked the term up properly, months later, out of a strange, deliberate curiosity, the way you sometimes need to hold a wound up to better light before it can actually close. In accounting, overhead refers to the ongoing costs of running a business that aren't directly tied to producing a specific product: rent, utilities, administrative salaries, the unglamorous infrastructure everyone needs and almost nobody wants to be the one paying for. It is, definitionally, not supposed to be a value judgment. It's simply a category. What Trent did, standing in that meeting with his oat milk cortado, was take a neutral accounting term and weaponize it into a referendum on whether a person's decades of expertise counted as an asset or a liability, based entirely on how replaceable he personally found them at a glance. I think about how many other people, in how many other rooms, have had that exact same quiet violence done to them with a single word, dressed up as a business observation instead of what it actually was, which was cruelty with a spreadsheet vocabulary. I don't own that word anymore the way I did the day he said it. I've made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with a scar, not because it doesn't mean anything, but because it eventually stops being the first thing you see when you look at yourself. These days, when I hear a young executive somewhere use it carelessly about someone with more tenure and less visibility than they have, I make a specific point of asking, in whatever room I'm standing in, exactly what that person actually does. Not because I need the answer, but because I want the room to notice, the way nobody noticed for me in that meeting, exactly how much invisible weight the legacy overhead tends to actually be carrying. If I could go back and sit down next to the version of myself who locked herself into the handicap stall on the 4th floor and counted 14 cracks in the grout to keep from crying, here's what I think I'd actually say to her, knowing everything I know now. I wouldn't tell her it gets better, because that's the kind of thing people say when they don't actually know yet whether it will, and she'd see through it in about 4 seconds flat. I'd tell her, instead, that the folder in her closet, the one marked Del Rio, confidential, the one she'd been hiding for 6 months out of a mix of ambition and quiet self-preservation, was going to matter more than she currently understood. Not because it would make her rich, though it eventually would, and not because it would let her humiliate the boy who just humiliated her, though it eventually did that too. I'd tell her it was going to matter because it was proof, even then, even in the worst hour of her professional life, that some part of her had never actually believed the story Trent Ashcombe was telling about her in that meeting. Some part of her had already been quietly building an entirely different ending, months before she needed it. The way you build a shelter before the storm arrives instead of after. Because some instinct in her had understood, long before her conscious mind caught up, that the ground under her feet was shifting. I'd tell her the fear she felt sitting on that toilet lid in a silk blouse. The specific, cold fear that came not from his cruelty, but from his certainty, from the sense that he had a plan she couldn't yet see the shape of, was correct. He did have a plan. She was right to be afraid of it. And she was also, though she couldn't have known it yet, already 3 steps ahead of it, in a gray blazer, on a hotel notepad, in a language she'd been quietly practicing for exactly this moment for longer than even she had realized. I get messages now, more than I ever expected to, from people who found some version of this story and recognized something of themselves in it. Usually women, usually somewhere between their late 30s and mid-50s, usually describing some variation of the same basic architecture. Years of quiet, foundational work, a younger and less qualified person parachuted in above them, and a single moment of public humiliation that made explicit what had actually been true, unspoken, for a long time before it. I don't have a universal formula for what to do with that feeling, because my own solution required a specific set of circumstances most people simply don't have available to them. A supplier mid-divorce, a dead sister's trust, a marriage sturdy enough to survive genuine financial terror, and, as it turned out, a shadow benefactor with her own decades-old grievance, quietly stacking the deck in my favor without my knowledge or consent. I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended any of that was replicable on demand. But here's what I do think is replicable, and it's the part I actually want you to take from all of this, more than the specific mechanics of a furniture factory acquisition. Start documenting your own value before you need to prove it to someone else, in writing, in specific terms, the actual crises you personally prevented and the actual dollar figures attached to them. Because the moment someone tries to tell you your work amounts to overhead, you want more in your hand than just your own certainty that they're wrong. Keep a version of your own folder in your own closet, whatever that folder looks like in your particular field. Not necessarily a corporate acquisition, but some concrete, portable proof of what you're actually worth that doesn't depend on any single employer's willingness to acknowledge it. And pay attention, earlier than feels comfortable, to the moment a workplace relationship stops being mutual. I ignored that signal for at least 8 months longer than I should have, telling myself it was loyalty when it had actually, quietly, already become one-sided. You will very likely do the same thing, because the training that makes so many of us good at this work, the patience, the diplomacy, the willingness to absorb friction so a larger system keeps functioning smoothly, is the exact same training that makes us slow to notice when that patience has stopped being reciprocated. Notice it anyway. Notice it as early as you possibly can. It will save you months, maybe years, of counting cracks in bathroom grout, waiting for permission to believe what you already know. Rosalind, my publicist, has asked me more than once why I keep agreeing to tell this story in any form, whether it's a keynote or a podcast or, now, whatever this particular written account turns out to become. It would be simpler, she points out correctly, to let the trade press version stand, the clean, flattering 10-minute video shape of the story. Female executive dismantles nepotism. Cue triumphant music. Roll credits, and get back entirely to the actual unglamorous work of running a $110 million manufacturing operation across 3 facilities and 400 people. I keep telling it, honestly, for reasons that are more selfish than they probably should be. Telling the fuller version, the one with the 8-month resume gap and the hurricane and the specific, private shame of realizing I'd been Vivian's instrument for 6 weeks before I understood it, is the only way I've found to actually process what happened to me, instead of just performing a tidy summary of it at industry conferences. Every time I tell it more completely than the last time, I understand something new about my own decisions that the clean version had let me quietly avoid. I'm also telling it because I remember, vividly, exactly what it felt like to be sitting at my own desk, humiliated, with no story yet to comfort myself with about how it might eventually turn out. I didn't have anyone else's fuller, messier account available to me in that moment. Just the vague, second-hand cultural sense that some people, somewhere, eventually turn these moments around, without any specifics about what that actually costs or requires or feels like at 3 in the morning in a parking lot in Corpus Christi. I'd like there to be one more, fuller, messier account out there in the world than there was for me, on the small chance it reaches someone at exactly the moment they need it, the way I desperately needed something and didn't have it. That's the whole reason, really. Not vindication. Not even the money, though I won't pretend the money doesn't matter. Just the hope that somewhere, someone currently sitting in their own version of that fourth-floor bathroom stall, counting cracks in the grout, gets to read this and understand, a little sooner than I did, that the folder in the closet is worth building before anyone ever hands you a reason to open it. I still have the photograph Vivian sent me, the faded one. Trent as a newborn, his mother exhausted and luminous in a hospital bed, decades before either of them became characters in a corporate morality tale nobody involved would have chosen for themselves. I had it framed eventually, a small, plain black frame, nothing dramatic, and it sits on a shelf in my home office rather than my actual office, because I never wanted it to become a talking point for visitors or a prop in someone else's version of the story. I look at it sometimes when I'm making a decision I know is going to hurt someone. Even when the decision is correct, even when it's necessary. A vendor contract we have to end, a role we have to eliminate as the company restructures around new efficiencies. The ordinary, unavoidable friction of running something at scale. It reminds me that everyone standing on the other side of my hardest decisions was, at some point, exactly that small, and unformed, and entirely unresponsible for whatever they'd eventually grow into, good or bad. It doesn't change the decisions. It changes how I make them. And more importantly, how I explain them afterward, to the people affected, in language that treats them like whole human beings instead of line items. I don't know if Vivian meant the photograph as an apology, a warning, or simply the truest thing she had left to give me once every other layer of manipulation had burned away. I've decided, after 3 years of turning it over, that it doesn't especially matter which it was intended as. What matters is what I chose to do with it, which was to let it make me more careful with people, in the exact place where she had chosen, however understandably, to become less careful with the one person she should have protected most. I'm writing the last of this from my actual office, the real one, in a converted warehouse space about 4 miles from Del Rio's original Guadalajara facility, at the kind of hour, early, before the floor shift starts, coffee actually good this time, unlike a certain break room I could name, that has become, over 3 years, my genuine favorite part of any given day. Through the window, I can see the loading dock where Carmen's redesigned finishing process cuts material waste 11% better than it used to. Somewhere in the analytics department, Yasmin is almost certainly already at her desk, 45 minutes before she technically needs to be, wanting to understand one more piece of the whole system. Daniel is asleep 4 miles from here, in the house we didn't sell to take Sable's money, in a life that looks, on the surface, remarkably similar to the one we had before any of this happened, except for the specific, quiet knowledge both of us now carry about exactly what we're each capable of when the ground genuinely shifts under our feet. I don't know where Vivian Ashcombe is this morning, or whether the silver-haired consultant in Lisbon really is her, quietly rebuilding other founders' broken companies with the same precision she once used to nearly break mine. I don't know exactly what Trent is doing in Ohio, or whether the quieter version of him Devin described has held, or whether some part of him is still, somewhere, waiting for a chance to prove himself the way his father's approval always seemed to demand he prove himself, to people who were never actually going to be satisfied no matter what he did. I know what I'm doing this morning, though, which is the only part of the story I ever actually had full control over. And it turns out that's been more than enough. People occasionally ask, usually in the slightly morbid, slightly wine-fueled way these questions come up at dinner parties, what I'd want said about me at the end of all this, the eulogy version, the summary sentence, the thing that gets carved into whatever the modern equivalent of a headstone turns out to be. For a long time after the fight with Trent, I would have answered with something about vindication, about being the woman who refused to be called overhead and proved it, about the folder in the closet and the 51% and the boardroom where a spoiled heir's face went the color of a ripe tomato. I don't want that anymore, or at least, not only that. I want it said that I built something that outlasted the anger that started it, that the company survived past the point where the story was interesting, past the trade press cycle, past the keynote circuit, into the unglamorous decades where it either becomes something real or quietly dissolves back into the ordinary churn of businesses that were only ever really about one dramatic moment. I want it said that Carmen ran the best finishing line in the industry for a decade after this story stopped being anyone's headline. I want it said that Yasmin, whoever she becomes, traces some piece of her own path back to a hiring decision that bet on an 8-month gap instead of automatically filtering it out. I want it said, honestly, that I got some of it wrong, that I let a manipulative, brilliant, deeply wounded woman use me as her instrument for 6 weeks before I fully understood the shape of what she was doing. And that instead of pretending otherwise afterward, I built the rest of my company as a long, ongoing correction to that specific mistake. More transparency with my own team than Vivian ever offered me. Fewer secrets held in reserve as leverage. Fewer people treated as pieces on somebody else's board without their full knowledge and consent. Mostly, though, I want it said that when a 29-year-old man with a jawline like a ruler and a resume built by someone else's assistant called 14 years of my work overhead in front of 41 silent colleagues, I didn't disappear quietly, and I didn't spend the rest of my career proving him wrong out of spite alone. I built something that made his particular kind of cruelty cheap, careless, dressed up in accounting language, genuinely, structurally obsolete inside the walls I controlled. Not because I needed the world to know I'd won, because I'd finally stopped needing anyone's permission to build something that was entirely, undeniably mine. My father died 3 years before Trent Ashcombe ever walked into that Tuesday meeting, which means he never saw any of what I've just told you. Never saw the folder, the acquisition, the boardroom, the photograph, the promotion I gave Carmen, the apprenticeship program that now carries a version of his own name attached to its funding, quietly, in a line item most people who benefit from it will never notice. He was a machinist for 31 years at a plant that made industrial fasteners, the kind of unglamorous manufacturing work that nobody makes documentaries about. And he used to tell me, when I was young and impatient and convinced that the fastest path up mattered more than the sturdiest one, that the people who actually kept a factory running were almost never the ones whose names ended up on the building. He said it without bitterness, mostly, as a simple observation about how the world tended to work, though I think now, having spent 3 years running my own factory floor, that there was more grief buried in that observation than he ever let on to a teenage daughter who wasn't yet equipped to hear it properly. I thought about him constantly during the 6 weeks of the fight, and more, honestly, during the 2 quieter years afterward, doing the unglamorous work of actually running something instead of just winning it. I thought about him specifically the day I stood in that Guadalajara warehouse, telling 300 people I'd turned down Sable's money, because I understood, in that exact moment, that I was making the decision he would have recognized as correct, even though he'd never once, in his own working life, been given the power to make an equivalent one himself. I named the apprenticeship program after him, quietly, without telling anyone the reason beyond a brief line in the internal announcement, the Raymond Callaway Fellowship, 8 positions a year, first preference given to candidates whose resumes show exactly the kind of gap that used to get automatically filtered out before anyone bothered to read the explanation attached to it. I think, of everything this whole story eventually produced, that's the piece I'm proudest of. And it's also the piece that will never make it into any trade press article because there's no villain in it, no boardroom confrontation, no satisfying reveal. Just a daughter, finally in a position to build the kind of second chance her father spent 31 years quietly deserving and never once receiving. There's one more piece of this I've been putting off telling you, mostly because it doesn't resolve as neatly as everything else, and I've come to suspect that's exactly why it's the piece worth ending on. About 2 years after everything settled, Naomi Reyes, my attorney, the woman who handed out those slim black folders like party favors in a boardroom full of stunned executives, called me with news that had nothing to do with Del Rio or Ashcombe and Vale at all. She'd been contacted, through a referral she couldn't fully explain, by a woman in her early 60s who ran a regional textile distributor and had just been publicly humiliated by her own company's newly installed innovation officer, a role that turned out, on inspection, to be filled by the chairman's nephew. The woman wanted to know, Naomi told me carefully, whether there was any chance I'd be willing to talk to her. Not for a video, not for a press piece, just a conversation, one operator to another, about what actually happens in the 6 weeks after a moment like that, before anyone knows how the story ends. I said yes immediately, and I've said yes 11 more times since then, to 11 different women in 11 different industries, none of whose stories I'll tell you here, because they aren't mine to tell, and most of them, wisely, chose not to buy a controlling stake in anything at all. Some of them simply needed someone to confirm that the fear was rational, that the folder in the closet was worth building even if they never used it, that the specific, cold certainty of watching someone with less experience and more confidence describe your career as replaceable is a legitimate injury worth taking seriously, rather than an overreaction to be quietly absorbed and moved past. I don't know how most of their stories end yet. That's the loose thread, the one without a tidy resolution. 11 ongoing situations, 11 women somewhere in the middle of their own version of the bathroom stall, the grout, the counting. I check in with a few of them periodically. 2 have left their companies entirely and started something new. 1 stayed and, through a combination of documentation and a very good employment lawyer, got the innovation officer's role restructured out from under him within a year. The rest are still figuring it out, the way I was still figuring it out for most of 6 genuinely terrifying weeks before any of us knew whether any of this would actually work. I think that's the most honest way I can end this. Not with a bow, not with a final triumphant image of me standing in a boardroom I'd earned rather than inherited, though that moment happened, and I've told you about it, and I still think about it more than I probably should. I want to end with the 11 women whose stories aren't finished yet, because that's closer to the truth of how this actually works. Not one clean, satisfying arc, but an ongoing, unglamorous, compounding series of people deciding, one Tuesday at a time, that the folder in the closet is worth building before anyone ever hands them a reason to open it. So if you've made it this far, through the humiliation and the severance and the folder hidden in a closet, through Vivian and her voicemail and the photograph of a newborn who grew up to call 14 years of someone else's work overhead. Through the hurricane and Carmen's promotion and my father's name quietly attached to 8 fellowship spots a year, I want to leave you with the same thing I try to leave everyone who reaches out to me after finding some version of this story. It was never really about the furniture factory. It was about the folder. It was about noticing, earlier than felt comfortable, the exact moment a workplace relationship stopped being mutual, and refusing to keep quietly paying my half of a contract someone else had already stopped honoring. It was about understanding that the people who call your expertise dead weight are almost always the ones who've never once had to carry anything heavy themselves, and that the correct response to being underestimated is rarely rage for its own sake. It's proof, built quietly, in advance, long before anyone hands you a reason to need it. Trent Ashcombe is learning inventory systems from the ground up in Ohio. Vivian Ashcombe is somewhere outside Lisbon, or she isn't, quietly rebuilding other people's broken companies with the same precision she once used against her own family. Walter Ashcombe and I do fair, unremarkable business together now, the way you can with someone you'll never fully trust but no longer need to defeat. And I am sitting in an office 4 miles from a factory floor where 340 people, plus 11 more coming through this year's fellowship, are building something that started 3 years ago with a folder hidden in the back of my closet and a promise I made to a sister who never got to see any of it. That's the whole story, told as fully as I know how to tell it. Not clean, not entirely fair to everyone in it, myself included, but true, which I've come to believe matters more than clean ever will. If you're currently sitting in your own version of that 4th-floor bathroom stall, counting cracks in the grout, doing the math on whether you have the strength to build your own folder, you do. Start tonight. Start smaller than you think you need to, and don't wait for someone to call you overhead before you decide your own work was worth defending all along. Thank you for reading this far. If any part of it sounded like your own Tuesday, I hope it helps the way I wish something like it had helped me.